Final Fantasy II is weirdly fascinating to me, as from what I can tell, it may simultaneously be one of the most influential and most underappreciated entries in the series. Now, let me explain. After the success of the first game, rather than simply expanding on those initial ideas like many others would, Square decided to completely reinvent some of those concepts for the follow-up. This, along with a larger focus on story and characters, garnered critical praise upon its release, and established one of the core tenets of the franchise moving forward. No two games would be the same on a mechanical level. Sure, they may share monsters, bosses, character names, and what have you, but none of them would play the same. Even out of the majority of numbered entries that utilize turn-based combat, there are key differences between each of them that make them unique from one another. This is one of the defining aspects of Final Fantasy, and it was FF2 that started that trend. However, despite this fact, I have consistently seen Final Fantasy II at the bottom of various rankings of the series. Of course, rankings are largely subjective for the people that make them, and I can see why this game would be towards the bottom in comparison to other entries. Just because it's influential doesn't mean it's good, and even if it's good, it would still likely get overshadowed by many of the others, especially since quite a few of them are considered to be some of the greatest RPGs ever made. But, to see it consistently come in last, or at least below Final Fantasy I? Now, while I consider Final Fantasy I to be a respectful first step, I don't think it's all that worth playing in a modern environment. If you want to know my feelings as to why, I would advise looking at my previous video on the subject. Having played both of these games back to back, I can absolutely say that Final Fantasy II is the better game in nearly every way. The richer narrative, better written characters, a new approach to character customization, all of these and more are major improvements over the first game in my opinion. And while there are a few areas where I believe this game falters, I do think that it is still much more worthwhile to play over its predecessor. Now, before we begin, I just want to clarify that for my playthrough, I emulated the 20th anniversary PSP version of the game, just as I did with Final Fantasy I. The original Famicom release never made it outside of Japan. Although an American localization was planned, it was scrapped in favor of bringing over Final Fantasy IV, which was marketed here as FF2. The first time FF2 saw an international release was in Final Fantasy Origins on the original PlayStation, which featured SNES-style remakes of both 1 and 2. Next came 1 and 2 Dawn of Souls on the Game Boy Advance, which added the playable Soul of Rebirth epilogue. And then there's the 20th Anniversary Edition, which is the definitive version of the game. It has the best visuals and sound, it contains all the content from past releases, as well as new content in the form of the Arcane Labyrinth. So if you want to play this version for yourself, the links to the emulator and ROM will be down in the description. Now, without further ado, let's talk about Final Fantasy II, and how it may just be the best sequel the first game could have asked for. We're introduced to a world freshly thrust into conflict. The Emperor of Palamachia has summoned an army of monsters from the underworld, which he is using to conquer everyone and everything. A rebel army arose in the kingdom of Fynn to combat these forces, but the realm soon fell to an all-out assault by the Emperor. It is in the aftermath of this attack that we are introduced to our main characters, 4 friends fleeing for their lives as their home is overrun by monsters. While they can be named by the player, they are canonically known as Firion, Guy, Maria, and Leon. As they attempt to escape from the burning city, the monsters catch up to them, where they are defeated with ease and left for dead. Fortunately, the remnants of the rebel army come across them, and they are taken to the nearby town of Altair to be healed, which has been established as the new base for the rebel army. Upon waking, Firion, Guy, and Maria are shocked to learn that Leon was not found among them, as he was likely taken by the Emperor. This, along with the fact that their families and homes have been destroyed by the Emperor's forces, prompted them to join the resistance to help take down the Empire. Now, I think this is a strong start to the adventure. Even with what little dialogue they have, our main characters are given defined personalities and motivations. While they all want to fight against the Empire, Firion especially is looking to avenge his fallen family and home. Guy is a kindly soul who'll do anything for his friends, and Maria is extremely caring and wants to rescue her brother Leon from the Empire. While I did give Final Fantasy I some credit for the idea of having a party of blank slates for the sake of customization, that concept will almost always be outdone by the establishment of defined characters, and the way FF2 does it is a fantastic demonstration of that. However, this aspect especially shines with the game's side characters. Over the course of the story, the party meets various characters who play key roles in the adventure. While some of them are just active NPCs, others will actually join you and become the fourth member of the party, if only for a temporary stay. Most of them, especially major story characters, have quite a bit of dialogue that helps keep them both memorable and sympathetic as the story ramps up. For instance, we have Princess Hilda, the leader of the rebellion and one of the first characters that you meet. She is a pretty tragic character. Her father, the king, was gravely wounded in the attack on Fynn, eventually resulting in his death. And Scott, her fiancé and the prince of the allied kingdom of Kashwan, was killed during the same attack in an attempt to defend the castle. When the party witnesses his death, Scott doesn't want them to pass on his love to Hilda, because he knows it will just sadden her even more than what she's already feeling. She has to lead what little is left of her fallen kingdom against seemingly hopeless odds, and as such is very protective of her subjects. She initially doesn't even allow Firion and his friends to join the rebellion out of fear for their safety, and frankly, I don't blame her. Granted, she is probably one of the better written characters simply because she has the most to do, but even characters with fairly minor appearances are given just enough. Cid's main purpose is to help destroy the Emperor's Dreadnought airship and to give the party his own personal airship after he dies, so they can access one of the final story dungeons. It's not much, but this is a sign of his trust and respect for them, as he loves his airship like nothing else in the world and has devoted his entire life to it. And hey, clearly this was enough for someone, seeing as how Square made Cid a staple character in the series from this game onward. In fact, quite a few elements introduced in this game would become mainstays in later installments. In addition to the first iteration of Cid, we also have the introduction of Chocobos and the Dragoon class, both of which have become iconic parts of the series, with the Chocobo especially being one of its many mascots. Leviathan debuted in this game, although not as a summon or a boss as it's more often known for, but as a guardian and subsequent mini-dungeon that you have to get through. And we also have the first instance of an Emperor and Empire as an antagonistic force, a concept that Final Fantasy would reuse and reimagine quite often for later entries. Now, let's talk about the combat. It's still your standard turn-based gameplay, with the usual attack, magic, defend, item, and flee options that were in the previous game. However, now we have the option to position our party members in either the front or back row. Members placed in the back row are more or less immune to most physical attacks, but they can still be damaged by ranged weapons and magic. So putting a character with particularly weak physical defense in the back is usually a good option. But that's a minuscule change from the first game. The real fun in the combat comes from the leveling system. Unlike its predecessor in other traditional RPGs, where characters have an overall level that increases with experience, here each individual skill and stat has its own level, which increases as they are used more and more. If you want a character to deal more damage with swords, have them use swords more in battle. It'll increase their sword proficiency and their strength. Do you want them to be better at healing magic? Make them use more healing spells to increase their spirit stat. This mechanic is especially effective with magic, as you can level up spells along with the associated stats, so focusing on one specific spell will make it especially powerful over time. Personally, I love the ideas behind this system. It allows for each character to be extremely customizable and suit whatever party composition you're going for. It's practically the inverse of the first game. Instead of choosing each character's class from the start, you can develop each one over time, and in some cases even mix classes together. My Firion was essentially a black mage with swords, and he could deal heavy damage either way because his strength and intelligence were so high. However, this concept of leveling up proficiencies does pose a few problems, with its major criticism being just how easily broken it is. While you're supposed to level up your skills and stats normally by using them on enemies, people quickly found out that it was much quicker and easier to simply use them on other party members. They aren't as frail as normal enemies, and you can control their damage output with equipment and protective spells. And if you have enough MP and healing magic, you can extend the leveling sessions for quite some time. So what could be several dozen encounters to level up a specific stat or spell could be accomplished in one, at least if you have the patience for it. Now, I think this is hilarious. Just imagine, a bunch of friends beating each other up to get stronger while an actual enemy is just sitting there watching. Now, of course I used this method, and while it was extremely grindy as expected, luckily my PSP emulator's speed-up feature helped eliminate most of the tedium. Without it, I probably would have gone mad. That being said, I tried not to break the game too much. I only really grinded when I felt I needed to, and I didn't fully max out everyone's stats or anything like that. The game would still be enjoyable without it being a complete cakewalk. Now, I'm not saying this is a good mechanic, just that I personally enjoyed exploiting it. The easily exploitable nature of it is probably why we've never seen anything quite like it again, and the inherently grindy nature of it is also a major issue. To save up on time, I think it would have been nice if there were consumable items which permanently raised a character's stats and proficiencies, but for that to be very effective, it would need to be quite a large boost, and consequently the items would probably be rare and in limited supply. Either way, it doesn't matter too much. I would rather have fun with a broken system than slog through a boring one, and at least it allowed me to focus more on other aspects like the presentation and story. So, going into this, I expected this game to reuse a lot of the same assets from the other PSP remake, namely the overworld and character sprites. And while some of that is still present to a degree, I think the game does a pretty good job at keeping itself visually distinct from its sister remake. If anything, the visuals have been significantly improved. The enemy sprites and backdrops appear even more detailed than before. Dungeons feature more dynamic visuals, little animations like the flicker of lamps or the movement of water, and even more foreground effects like snow and rays of light. While these may seem like small additions, they do go a long way in helping the game stand out just a little bit more. Now, one of the few weak areas of the game for me is the music. It's not bad, in fact there are some tracks that I quite like. The Castle Pandemonium theme is bombastic and in your face, very fitting for the final dungeon. And the Magician's Tower theme almost sounds like something out of old school Castlevania with its tinny piano sounds. But other than those exceptions, nothing really stands out to me all that much. Of course, this game gave us the fabled Chocobo theme, but here it sounds unfinished. It just repeats the same intro build-up over and over again with no climax, and it quickly becomes annoying rather than enjoyable. In fact, most of the battle themes fall into a similar vein. They're not bad, but they get repetitive, which isn't a good thing when the majority of your playtime is spent in the combat. This is one of the few aspects that I think the first game actually did much better, as I found that soundtrack to be more consistently enjoyable, at least for me. The other area where I think this game stumbles a bit is with the bosses, as most of them are just normal enemies that can be encountered later on in the game. A sergeant in Samet Falls, a Red Soul in Kashwan, a trio of chimeras in Dice Cavern, none of these really felt like boss fights to me. They lack the scale that bosses should impose on the player, and as such these just felt cheap. Even Behemoth, the boss of the Palamekian Colosseum, which I was really excited to fight initially, can be found not long after in the overworld. Now, I understand why this was done. They wanted to demonstrate how much the party has grown over the course of the game. What used to be powerful enemies are now little more than a distraction in the party's wake. But the problem is they make up almost the entirety of the game's boss battles until the final area of the game. Up until then, the only encounter I would consider to be a unique boss fight would be Borghen, but he's meant to be a joke fight anyway, so I'm not even sure he counts. Even when you have the chance to finally fight some real bosses in Pandemonium, they are mostly optional, guarding endgame gear which you can choose not to pursue. They don't have a role in the story at all, and because of that, they're not very memorable apart from their designs, as good as they may be. Compared to the towering bosses of the first game, this was a pretty big disappointment. Now, the story of FF2 is probably the biggest departure from 1, not just because of the use of characters as I mentioned earlier, but because the events are given a sense of weight and consequence. Death and destruction are pretty much the themes of this game, with people and even entire towns being destroyed as the story progresses. The previously mentioned Dreadnought goes on a rampage after we fail to halt its construction, and we see its destructive power in various towns as it makes a beeline for the rebellion. They are covered in impact craters and the buildings are barely standing, with the few survivors only able to say, "They're all dead." And later on, these towns would be completely destroyed, to the extent that they cannot even be visited anymore. And then there's the Dragoons, the wyvern-riding warriors of Deist, who were all wiped out when their dragon's water supply was poisoned by the Emperor. With their mounts gone, these noble fighters stood no chance against the opposing forces. Hell, the Emperor is literally summoning armies from the underworld, aka the land of the dead. Death is everywhere in FF2. And the party isn't safe either. While the main three have plot armor, half of the party members that you recruit on your journey die in various acts of self-sacrifice. And it would be almost comical if it wasn't so sad. Minwu, the white mage who saved their lives at the start of the game, gives his life so the party can access the ultimate magic to use against the Emperor. Joseph, a miner who is helping the resistance, uses all of his strength to hold back a boulder meant to crush the party, with his final thoughts being on his daughter Nellie. While I do think these moments of tragedy happen a bit too often, it does fit the game's tone. It's a war. People die. Whether they're friends or strangers, death is an inherent part of conflict. But these deaths are for a noble cause. They died so that others might live, so Firion and company could accomplish their mission to stop the Emperor and restore peace to the world. And finally, it looks like that may just happen. Upon gaining the Ultima Tome, the party shows up to the recently retaken kingdom of Fynn and finds it under attack. After the destruction of his dreadnought, the Emperor called upon his dark sorcery to summon a massive cyclone, which he used to utterly destroy the surrounding area and towns. Fynn is the last line of defense, and it cannot withstand a second attack. The Emperor sits in his castle within the cyclone, but no one is able to pierce the winds to get inside. That is, except for Ricard, the last dragoon of Deist, who had previously been trapped within the bowels of Leviathan. He calls upon the newly hatched last wyvern, and the party are flown into the cyclone for the final confrontation. They defeat the Emperor, and the world is seemingly saved. However, the Dark Knight, the Emperor's second in command, seizes control of his army and plans to take over the world for himself. Upon his confrontation, it is revealed that the Dark Knight was in fact Leon, Maria's brother who had been separated from the party at the game's beginning. Now, why did Leon join the Emperor who destroyed his home and murdered his family? We're never given an answer for this, and that's one of the few problems I actually have with the story. There's some talk of him possibly being under the Emperor's control, or maybe seeing his home in ruin hardened his heart and he felt the need to stay on the winning side. But none of these are definitive answers, and considering his connection with Firion and the others, as well as the fact he becomes the true fourth member of the party, I would say his motivations are pretty important. But anyway, just as the party is about to face off against Leon, the Emperor suddenly returns from the dead. Now he has become the ruler of Hell itself, and he plans on taking over the world with his newfound power. Ricard sacrifices himself so that the party can escape from the initial onslaught, and the newly reformed friends must journey through the underworld to reach Castle Pandemonium, the palace of the ruler of Hell. At which point they make it to the Emperor and defeat him for good, and peace is truly restored to the world. In the aftermath, plans are made to rebuild what was lost. Hilda and Scott's brother Gordon plan on combining what was left of their kingdoms, in the hopes that they may even be better than what came before. The Dragoons have the chance to live on as the last wyvern bonds with one of the last children of Deist. But even in the midst of these happier times, echoes of the past remain. There is a rift between our heroes, specifically between Leon and the others. He cannot live with himself for the things he'd done in service to the Empire. He knows that things can never be the same again, and as such decides to leave his friends and family who worked so hard to find him. While Maria pleads with her brother to stay, Firion accepts his decision, saying that when the time comes, he'll be ready to welcome him back with open arms. Now, I think this ending helps to make up some for the initial failings of Leon's reintroduction. While there is hope for better things to come, it's not a fairy tale ending. The world was all but destroyed, with untold casualties. It takes time to move on from that, and I imagine that would be especially difficult for someone who helped cause all that suffering. So of course Leon would want to distance himself from the people he hurt, even if they are his friends and family. But even despite that, they will still be waiting for him when he's ready to come home. Now that the story's finished, there's the matter of the post-game content. Upon completion of the main story, we are given access to Soul of Rebirth. This is essentially a micro-campaign which acts as an epilogue, featuring Minwu, Scott, Joseph, and Ricard. They have to fight through the afterlife to reach the light half of the Emperor. After the Emperor's initial demise, he was split into light and dark halves, which became the rulers of heaven and hell. As the light and inherently good side of the Emperor, he claims to have brought these fallen allies here to simply ask for their forgiveness. However, they quickly realize that the Light Emperor is still just as evil as the Dark, and so they defeat him at the same time Firion and co. defeat the Dark Emperor in Pandemonium. This completely destroys him for good, and with their duties fulfilled, the fallen heroes are able to move on, presumably to the real afterlife. Now, I like the idea behind this. It's a nice send-off for these characters, it gives them a little extra to do outside of the main story, and it provides some new context around why we see their spirits during the game's ending. It also fits with the game's overall themes of death and hope, with the spirits of the departed assisting our main heroes even from beyond the grave. Now that's all well and good, but in terms of actual gameplay, it's a bit of a mess. Apart from Scott, who you never had as a main party member, everyone in the group has the same stats, levels, and equipment that they had when they died. The problem with this is that these characters are all used in different parts of the story, and as such have drastically different levels and stats between them. Ricard was the best in the group by far simply because he had been in the main party for the longest and had close to endgame gear. But Joseph, who was only with the party for a short time in the first third of the game, he had crappy gear and even worse stats. The solution of this was, of course, grinding, but my usual method wouldn't work, at least not right away. I couldn't speed through the grinding sessions not just because my character levels weren't consistent, but also because the enemies weren't consistent. For every encounter that I could easily wipe out, there was another that could do the same to me. So I had to go through the first portion of the grinding in real time to make sure they wouldn't get destroyed. What should have been a 1.5 hour max adventure was extended to over 10 hours. This of course became easier over time as the characters got stronger, so I was soon able to start using the speed up more, but that still doesn't excuse the fact that the inconsistent levels that necessitated this grinding shouldn't have existed in the first place. I knew that these specific party members wouldn't stick around for very long in the main game, so I didn't feel the need to beef them up too much, and I instead focused on the main three. I will admit that I should have researched Soul of Rebirth beforehand in preparation for this, so that's on me. But the fact that this flaw potentially lengthens it to as much as 9+ hours of just grinding is absolutely ridiculous. That is a quarter of the time I spent on the entirety of the main story, in addition to its other extra content. Speaking of which, last but not least we have the Arcane Labyrinth, a set of dungeons added in the 20th Anniversary remake. Now, technically, this isn't post-game content, as you can access it at any time over the course of the story, but more of it does become unlocked as the story progresses. So I attempted it after the story's completion, mainly because it would be easier, and at that point I could just access everything at once. Over the course of the story, the party will learn various key terms. Asking specific people about some of them can provide important information, such as the use and location of certain story items, or just general information about the world and characters. This is a pretty cool and unique system that surprisingly existed in the original Famicom version, and the Arcane Labyrinth is designed around it. There are 3 Arcane Labyrinth dungeons on the overworld, with either 5, 10, or 15 floors depending on the location. In the entryways of each of these dungeons there is a flame, and telling it a key term will transport the party to a floor based on that specific term. Many of these floors have little challenges, which upon completion were rewarded with either a new key term or a hint for another floor, and at the end of each labyrinth we're confronted by a boss recycled from Pandemonium. Upon finishing all 3, we gain access to the Arcane Sanctuary, where we find a mage named Deumian. He will test our strength by summoning the monster Frakios, and upon its defeat, Deumian will ask us what we want. Depending on what we tell him and what terms we use in the labyrinths, he will give us either an elixir or a character's ultimate weapon, after which the sanctuary is sealed and we have to go through the labyrinths again in order to access it. The end goal of these dungeons is to acquire the key terms Oblivion, Hope, Destruction, and Guardian, and to play through their respective floors. Doing so will show us Deumian's backstory. In ancient times, magic was easily accessed and used by everyone, and as such, wars were incredibly destructive. Because of these wars, an especially destructive magic, simply dubbed Destroy, was created. However, it was deemed too devastating to be used, and was sealed away. Deumian was chosen to guard the spell, as he was extremely gifted in magic even at a young age. The seal he became a part of suspends his aging, so he is stuck down there, guarding a magic nuke for all eternity. Now, upon completing these floors and earning the Light of Hope, we have 2 new options. When Deumian asks us what we want, we can tell him either Destruction or Hope. If we say Destruction, he will fight us, and upon his defeat, we take the Destroy Tome. If we say Hope and give him the Light of Hope, he gives us the Revive Tome. Now both of these spells are equally useless. Destroy is a one-hit KO to everything including party members, leaving only the person who cast it at 1 health and no MP, while Revive heals everything including enemies, although it doesn't actually revive fallen team members. So what to do with Deumian is completely up to you if you decide to do anything at all. Either way, I see his story as pretty sad. He's a boy forced to guard another person's mistake, simply because he was gifted. He can never leave, and he can never rest. He will remain a guardian for all eternity. If you choose to give him hope, he gains back that which had long been lost to him, but it doesn't change the fact that he's still stuck down there, alone forever. Killing him and taking the Destroy Tome finally ends his torment, but then you've killed an innocent boy, and potentially unleashed a new destruction upon the world. While I'm not sure there is a true right answer for the situation, I chose to give him hope, because that's what we all need. Every single day, now more than ever, even when everything feels like it's on the brink of collapsing, if nothing else, hold on to hope. While things may be bad now, there is always the hope for a better tomorrow. I didn't expect to like Final Fantasy II as much as I did, and while it does have its problems, I do think it's absolutely worth playing today. It improves on the first in almost every possible way, with an actual narrative and somewhat interesting characters. It introduced key aspects of the series which persist to this day, and that influence cannot be understated. Am I reading into things too much? Maybe. Am I saying that this is the best Final Fantasy ever made? Of course not. Its narrative is still somewhat limited by the original hardware it was made for. It's not even my favorite Final Fantasy game I've played, and I haven't even played that many of them. But I do think that, after playing them both, Final Fantasy II is everything that the sequel should have been. And if nothing else, it should get some credit for that at least. Up next we have Final Fantasy III, the last of the Famicom Final Fantasies. Another Japan exclusive, and they're bringing back crystals. What did it do to set itself apart from 2, and how did it build on what came before with 1? We'll talk about it next time, and I hope to see you all there. Have an amazing day, everybody.